Welcome everybody to the 2021 Global Animal Disaster Management Conference. Our next session is Emerging Methods for Carcass Management During Disease Outbreaks and Natural Disasters by Gary Flory. It's a privilege to have Gary here, and if you're interested in his abstract or reading his bio, we have that on our website under speakers if you want to go and read that. Before we start, I just want to do some basic housekeeping. So the Zoom chat feature has been disabled for this session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll endeavour to get to your questions at the end of the presentation. We also would like to encourage you to use the hashtag GADMconf if you're using Twitter or other social media, and a short evaluation will be available as we exit this session. And just a reminder, we are recording, and those recordings will be made available after they've been edited. And we'll be launching those at our GADMAC award ceremony in July. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Gary, and over to you.
All right, thank you, Mel, appreciate it. And do feel free to interrupt me anytime if they're having issues with delays or sound issues. So please let me know, Mel. All right, well, again, it's a great privilege to be here today to talk to you about this issue. And the reason that it's so important to me that we have this conversation is because animal mortality management is something that we don't think about, in my opinion, nearly as much as we should, as we're thinking about disasters that impact animals. And so that's my goal today, is to sort of convince you that that's an important part of the discussion in this area. So to do that, I wanted to talk about a couple of different things. So first of all, again, my name is Gary Flory. I work for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality in the United States, and I also do consulting on these very issues. So three different topics that we're going to talk about today are really focused on some of the emerging technologies that we've been working on for improving how we manage mortalities. Again, this particular topic is not always a pleasant topic. In fact, it can be quite disturbing at times, and I do need to apologize. There may be some images here that can be a little bit disturbing, but it's really hard to talk about animal mortality management without some of those images. So my apologies up front for that. So we've really been working on some new and hopefully better ways to deal with animal mortality. I do want to talk about that today. There's three different conversations I want to have. One is about a new method that we call above ground burial. And another is this conversation around composting and how do we speed up that composting process. And then we want to talk also about the composting process and how we actually inactivate viruses or pathogens. So we'll talk about all three of those things. But before we do that, I really want to start the conversation by talking about why is this important? Why do we want to talk about animal mortality? You know, certainly we want to avoid animal mortality events whenever we can, but unfortunately, it's a reality of the world that we live in that we do have situations where we do have mortality that's associated with disease events or natural disasters. And when we do that, if we fail to have good plans and good methods for dealing with animal mortality, then we can have significant consequences. One of those consequences being a situation that you see here, and that is an environmental impact from carcass management activities. This is from a press report from South Korea, and it was a truckload of pigs that had died from African swine fever. And in the process of managing those pigs, those carcasses did end up leaking from the truck, running into the river. And what you see here on the right is the impact of that. So a river that's actually running red from the blood from those avian influenza infected pigs. Typically, environmental impacts from carcass management activities aren't this dramatic. Oftentimes, we tend to want to bury animals that have died from disease or natural disasters. And so we often don't see the impacts of that. But that doesn't mean that they're not there. Animals, are 65 to 85% moisture. That fluid, that liquid in those animals contains bacteria and viruses and a number of chemical constituents as well. Yeah, and so there certainly is impacts from that. And that can impact us as humans, but other animals as well. So the environmental impact is something that's so important, and I feel like we need to give it more attention. The other reason that that's important is because, what we also want to do when we manage animal mortality is to try to minimize impacts to other animals as well. So for example, here we can see in this chart, after an animal dies, if it died because of an animal pathogen, and we'll go with the example that I provided earlier of African swine fever. So if an animal dies of African swine fever, then the amount of virus in that animal is going to start to decrease over time. So you can see here in this example, at one day, it's the amount of virus in that animal starts to decrease, and it continues through time. The different lines are based on temperatures, because many pathogens are going to be influenced in their breakdown on the temperature. This particular data here is actually an example. It's based on avian influenza data, but it is just to provide an example. But what I wanted to show you is, while our pathogens, our virus in the example I was giving, decreases after the animal dies, the vector activity increases after those animals die. So in this case, the flies, their eggs get laid, they hatch, and our fly activity increases. So what we find ourselves in a situation of, if we do not manage our mortality well, if we don't have good plans in place, then we can find ourselves in a situation where we're getting other animals infected through vectors or just through carcasses being exposed to the environment and coming in contact with other animals. So it's important to have a plan so that we don't find ourselves in a situation for unmanaged mortality resulting in infecting other animals. The quick example that I'd like to give there is just recently here, actually this month, in a conversation about the management of pelican carcasses that from animals that had died. And this was in Western Africa, so many hundreds of animals were found dead. They had died from an avian influenza outbreak that was in this wildlife population. The situation is that, as often the case with wildlife, we don't really have a plan for managing mortality. And when we don't have a plan, that results in the kind of conversations that we had here just a few weeks ago. And, we have to consider, well, what do we do with this mortality? What is our plan? How can we move forward? And that always is a delay. And when you have a delay, this particular situation that I'm mentioning, it's a wildlife refuge. There's 350 species of birds in that area. And so failing to manage that mortality could potentially result in spreading of the virus to other animals and the death of other animals. So that's just one reason why it's important to make sure you have a plan, and not just within agriculture, but also within wildlife populations for dealing with mortality events. So I wanted to talk about above ground burial. This is a process that we have been doing some research on over the last few years, but really it was last year when we really focused a lot of our research to try to come up with our plan in case we do have an African swine fever outbreak or other livestock disease or natural disaster situation. This is just a visual depiction of above ground burial and what that actually looks like. Ultimately, it's quite simple. It really is just a shallow trench. So unlike deep burial, where you might have a trench that is 3 or maybe even 4 meters deep, this is a much shallower trench, only 60 centimeters deep. So there's a tremendously significant separation from groundwater as opposed to the deep burial situation. And you also have carbon material in the bottom of the trench that helps provide a really biologically active zone and also absorb some of the leachate coming from those carcasses. So just in summary, the process itself is really just a hybrid of composting and deep burial. But what happens is instead of being buried in that deep zone, you're burying these animals in that biologically active zone so that you can really begin to break down the carcasses, but also the microorganisms that are breaking down the carcasses are also using some of those nutrients as well, so there's less potential for environmental impact, and they're also breaking down the pathogens. Some benefits associated with this method. One, it's really quite simple. It doesn't cost very much. It's really easy to implement. And all of those things are pluses because the more costly or the more equipment that's required in order to dispose of carcasses, the more delay and the less likely you're going to be able to implement that method effectively. Again, I mentioned that separation from groundwater table. Really, deep burial is the go-to. You know, that's the disposal method that we have been using for thousands of years. Whenever we have an animal that dies, we dig a hole and we bury it in the ground. And certainly there are some areas where that's fine and that's safe to do. But the more animals you have, the greater, the less distance you have to the groundwater table, the more potential there is for environmental impact from that. I mentioned the carbon layer in the bottom. So we have that 30 centimeters of carbon, again, that absorbs that leachate and keeps it from migrating vertically to the groundwater table. Plus you have a vegetative layer that helps stabilize it and actually absorb some of the nutrients as well. So it's pretty flexible. It can be adapted for use anywhere in the world. We used it a number of different places, and it's easy to install with commonly available equipment. Really, the easiest way to talk about most things is to show you what it looks like. And so that's what I want to do here. Here's a couple of different trenches or systems that we've put in place. I guess the obvious thing to point out is these are very shallow trenches. And again, that's important because this shallow area of the soil is the biologically active zone. And so that's the area where we're going to get that breakdown of those animals. You can see here we're adding carbon material to those trenches. Again, that's going to absorb that leachate. And then we're placing the carcasses on top of that carbon material so that the moisture, the leachate that comes out of those animals can be absorbed into that carbon material while the carcasses themselves are being broken down. And then after we place the carcasses, then we return the soil that came from the trenches on top of the animals. It makes the mound that we see here. You vegetate that mound. And again, that vegetation is going to stabilize that mound. It's also going to take up some of those nutrients to facilitate that decomposition process. We've been doing a number of research projects and we've implemented the methodology in a number of different places, Virginia, Tunisia. You can see those other places as well. I just want to highlight a couple of observations from those projects. One, this was an interesting location here. This was a project where we did side by side in the high plains of Texas in the United States. It's very dry there. And typically we're going to see carcass decomposition much more rapidly in composting than we would in any kind of burial. But in this particular case, because it was so dry and the ground actually provided an insulating layer to hold some of that moisture in, we actually did get decomposition in this environment more quickly than we did in the composting environment. But again, that's going to be unusual. We're going to typically see breakdown more quickly in composting than we will in above ground burial. The other thing that I wanted to point out here, this was part of a grinding and composting and above ground burial project we did. We saw much more rapid decomposition when the material is ground ahead of time. On the right, you can see the evidence of the microbial activity that's breaking down the the flesh from those animals, and is a much more rapid process. In Oklahoma, we were looking at a number of different factors. Pathogen inactivation is one. We were looking at the pox virus that was injected into the marrow of the femurs of those animals. We're also doing entomology studies and environmental studies as well. And one of the things that we're often asked about when it comes to above ground burial, typically people say you have to bury the animals 1 meter or 2 meter down, because if you don't, then you're going to have a lot of vector activity. And on many of these projects, we've installed cameras to try to see, what kind of animal disturbance we're going to have. Here's just a picture of a fox that walked over the pile, a bear in the photo on the right. But in neither case were they interested in the activity, but they were just passing by. That's not to say if you don't do it well, you still could have some vector activity. So you want to make sure that you have the entire carcass covered by at least 30 centimeters of soil. Otherwise, you could have that vector activity. We've also, in some cases where we were concerned about vector activity or wild dogs, et cetera, we actually use this matting material. So this is the kind of material that's used to limit erosion on slopes. That was very successfully used. In this particular area, they had a significant amount of coyote activity, and so they wanted to be sure. So we did use some temporary fencing, which can be used. Just in summary, from the environmental standpoint, with this carbon material in the base, we've been able to limit the vertical migration of nutrients back to around background levels to about 60 centimeters below the bottom of the trench. So we are significantly reducing that migration of nutrients and therefore being more protective of the groundwater zone. So far, the work that we've done on pathogen inactivation, we've looked at Seneca virus and pox virus, and here we're looking at a bacteria, and we're finding the same type results, really limiting that activity through time. Again, the microbes are breaking down not just the carcasses themselves, but also the protective coverings on those viruses. All right, so next I wanted to talk about this grinding and composting, or grinding and above ground burial process. Again, conceptually, this is it's a little disturbing, but once the animals are dead, we really need to find ways to manage them in a way that, as I mentioned before, limits environmental impact or limits additional animals being impacted. The typical composting process that many of you are familiar with, again, it's not a complicated process. You have a layer of carbon material underneath the animals. The purpose of that is to allow oxygen to flow into the pile and also to absorb any leachate. And then you have your mixture of carbon material and carcasses in the center. And then you have an insulating cap on top. And so when you design it well and you're allowing lots of oxygen into the pile and you have your moisture content appropriately designed, so you want about 50% moisture or so, then you can really get piles that heat up, and in that process can inactivate pathogens and break down the carcasses. However, with this composting process, although it has many benefits, particularly when you are dealing with the pathogen, it can be quite slow for livestock in larger animals. So that is one of the reasons why we're exploring these additional options. Whereas if you were composting cattle, for example, it might take you 3 months to 6 months to compost that carcass. If you're dealing with a significant number of animals, that can be difficult to manage. So we were looking for a process that could speed that up. And also it takes quite a bit of carbon material, and it takes some expertise to make that happen. So to find a better way, if you had a large number of animals that were impacted by a disease or a natural disaster, what we wanted to look at is a process that could do that. And one way that we have done that is by looking at this grinding process. Again, my apologies that the images are a little bit disturbing, but I think it's necessary to fully appreciate this process and how it might works. Basically, we use a process to minimize the particle size and to blend it well with the carbon material so that we can speed up that process. We can take a composting process that might typically take 6 months, and we can get it to a point where we can compost animal carcasses within 30 days as opposed to 6 months. And you can recognize that there are some benefits to that. Just showing you a little bit of what the equipment looks like. It's not this particular process. Again, it takes some resources, so it's not something we would use for just a few animals. But if you had a big natural disaster or you had a disease outbreak, this might have some benefit. Again, it speeds up the process, increases the temperature, it takes less carbon material because you're getting a real good mix of carbon material and the animal carcasses. All right, the last portion that I wanted to talk about was disease outbreak. So African swine fever, I mentioned it some. We really don't have all the knowledge that we need to have in order to manage large disease outbreaks like this. We have proven that composting can be very effective in the inactivation of many pathogens. Certainly avian influenza we have lots of experience with, but a number of different pathogens as well. But we haven't actually done any research projects in looking at composting and its ability to inactivate the African swine fever virus. So really what I wanted to do here is just mention that we're in the process of doing a project with the African swine fever virus and composting in Vietnam at the moment. And we're quite hopeful at this point, based on the results that we're receiving with that project, that we're going to be able to demonstrate that composting is effective in not just inactivating many of the pathogens that we have more experience with, but that can also be effective with African swine fever as well. The other thing we're looking at also in another research project, this one also in Vietnam, is what happens with the African swine fever virus in manure slurry, because that is a significant challenge. When you have manure, it's very difficult to heat it or to chemically treat it to inactivate pathogens. So we're looking at what is the viability and how can we manage that manure in a way that is safe and effective as well. All right, so the last thing I wanted to mention today here is that there are a number of resources that are available. Again, as I talked about in the beginning, it's really important for there to be these carcass management, mortality management plans for every organizations that's dealing with disasters with animals. It's not a fun topic, and we'd all rather spend our time talking about other aspects, how to help animals survive. But the reality is, with these natural disasters and with these disease outbreaks, there can be mortality, there will be mortality. And if we don't have good plans in place on how to manage that mortality, then it can have some very significant implications, again, not just to the environment, but also to other impacted animals. So some resources that I wanted to point out here that are available, and you'll have my contact information. I'm happy to share any of these documents, but we have livestock composting protocols that we've developed within USDA, also poultry and bird composting protocols that are developed. Also, we have a standard operating procedure for above ground burial that is available. And within FAO, we have generated this focus on document. That's really a decision support tool. It goes through the typical disposal methods that are available and talks about pros and cons. I use some of the tables from that in our discussion here today. And for more details, the document on the right, you see that Carcass Management Guidelines from FAO. That's a document that we just finalized. It was published actually in January. So it's a very new document. It goes through in great detail how do you implement the methods, and talks about the technical process and calculations, et cetera. So I encourage you to take a look at those resources in order to help develop your own carcass management plans, so that when that situation arises, you're not spending time coming up with a plan. Instead, you're implementing your plan so that you can save additional wildlife or other animals. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. And we've left some time here, so I'm happy to answer any questions. Mel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary. That's a really fascinating area for someone like me who doesn't really get involved in that sort of part of the world, but so important to understand. We've got lots of questions, so I hope you're able to sort of stay on a little while to help answer those. If I could just start with a very quick one. Can you comment on the use of lethal injection solution and its effect on groundwater and the environment? We have a comment here that they know the AVMA is trying to limit the use of these drugs, and just wondering about the impact of that and in euthanasia.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's absolutely true. We really do try to discourage the use of euthanasia drugs when we're talking about large numbers of animals. And the reason for that is exactly as the questionnaire posed, is that those drugs actually can stay in the environment. They don't break down very easily. And so, for example, we're not comfortable composting animals that have been euthanized. That does break down, but it doesn't break down completely. And we've also done research that shows that those drugs can stay in the groundwater, in the soil, for quite some time. So absolutely, the injection with those euthanasia drugs is something that we discourage when we're talking about a large number of animals. If you have, just one or two animals and it's going to an incinerator, that's a different situation. But for these larger animal disasters, really do discourage the use of those drugs.
Another, I guess, a good segue to that in some ways is, as you'll appreciate here, we have a lot of bushfires and wildfires. And so so Lee here and our attendees has asked, if the animals are burnt, say post bushfire, will they decompose quicker than normal animals in shallow burial systems?
Yeah, so that's a great question, so it depends, and I really hate giving that answer. And the reason that I say that is there are so many factors. So typically for many of the brush fires, the fire moves very quickly and the animals are charred, but they still contain a lot of the moisture in those animals. And the decomposition process does require some moisture. So in most situations, it will not significantly decrease the decomposition of those carcasses. So carcasses that have been, animals that have died in these fires, for example, typically could be composted. They could be disposed of through above ground burial. We're still going to get biological activity in those carcasses, in those animals.
Someone here, Sue, has asked about can you give any details about the carbon material that's used and where you source it from?
Yeah, that's a great question. That it's really important to get good quality carbon material. And what I mean by good quality we can actually compost or use a wide variety of carbon materials for either composting or above ground burial. What is important is that we source materials that are clean. So we don't want painted material, we don't want treated material, we don't want material that have glass or stones or garbage or nails, et cetera, in them. Because especially with composting, what we're doing is we're going through that composting process, and in the end, we're going to be generating material that has benefit as a soil amendment. And it's not going to have that benefit as a soil amendment if it does have that garbage or other debris, or it has wood products in it that have been treated. So it's absolutely important to source clean materials. But from the material standpoint, we can use a wide variety of materials. I've used wood chips, I've used mulch, corn stover, peanut hulls, rice straw, any variety of materials, and they all have their benefits, and they all have their places where they're not as good. So, for example, you need good oxygen flowing into a compost pile. And if you use a material like a very fine sawdust underneath of a compost pile, then there isn't enough pore space to really get the oxygen flowing into that pile. So what you have to do is you have to look at what are the carbon materials that I have available and use the best material in the right location. So oftentimes we'll choose a different material from the base that we might include in the core. For the cap of the compost pile, you can have a material that's finer because you're trying to minimize the odors that come out of that pile, because it's the odors that can attract flies or wild dogs, etc. So lots of different materials can be used, but for some materials you might need to use more of them. Other materials you can use less. It's sort of a balancing act. And composting is a science, certainly, but it's also an art. So you sort of get used to looking at the resources that you have available and figuring out how to best utilize them.
Fantastic. Jennifer here asks, what equipment is used for actual grinding?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the grinding process, we've looked at a number of different pieces of equipment for that. So one area where it's really important to choose your equipment well is if you are dealing with a disease outbreak, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have a very physical process that's going to throw a lot of particles into the air if you have a disease outbreak. So if you're talking about avian influenza, for example, you don't want to go through a process that throws a lot of dust in the air that might contain those virus particles. Same way with African swine fever. So what we really look for is a process that can go through and grind a lot of animals quickly, but we don't want a lot of dust being discharged from those systems. So typically what we have found to work well is what we call these horizontal bed grinders. And the reason that we've used those is, one, because it does minimize the amount of dust particles that are thrown in the air, but two, they're available because they're used in a lot of landscaping, land clearing activities. So really, if you find the best piece of equipment that there is, but it isn't available, then it's not useful to you. So we really try to find what types of equipment can we use that's already available in the general area. And so these horizontal bed grinders have been one that we found that sort of meets both those criteria.
Thanks. And again, this one leads in quite nicely. So we have Katinka here asking, what would you recommend for developing countries where heavy machinery and inputs might not be available?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So a lot of the work that I have done has been in Southeast Asia, done a little work in the Caribbean as well. And really in those areas, what we're talking about is composting. Above ground burial is another method as well that we can use. And I will mention that the two FAO documents that I'm showing here on this slide, this focus on document and the carcass management guidelines, because they're FAO documents, they really focus on the methodologies that fit the very criteria that we're talking about. They don't include a lot of the high resource, high equipment focused processes. So again, those are some of the methods. Again, burial, depending upon the number of animals you have, burial can be used. Again, you got to watch your groundwater zone as well. One of the things I want to mention, just so composting, for example, one of the things working with the avian influenza outbreak in the Dominican Republic, what we found there is within their poultry houses, their buildings were not designed to have equipment in them, like we're familiar with in the United States, for example, where you have these skid steers that go in and can easily build compost piles. So the workaround there, and this is a sort of a workaround that can be used other places as well that are resource limited. We had access to manpower, and so we're actually able to build compost windrows in these poultry houses using laborers and shovels, and we were, it actually went quite efficiently. So, it's a matter of what resources do I have and figuring out the best way to make them work. And again, the two documents that you see on the right, I would really recommend for just sort of exploring options that might be available in those conditions.
Great, thank you. A quick one here. So this is Ian. Clearly we can see the environmental impact of all disposal systems, but what are the best or latest public health impacts? Are there any recent examples? And then just to clarify, so a zoonotic disease like anthrax, would that continue to be a public health hazard if the carcass died from non-zoonotic reasons like natural disaster or welfare cull?
Yeah, so thank you, Ian. Good questions, always good questions from Ian. So I will say, and I didn't talk about this here, not every organism is the same. So there are organisms where I talked a lot about composting here. So for example, composting, if we were talking about an organism, for animals that were impacted by anthrax, for example, composting is not going to be a method that we would recommend for that. One, because typically what we do is we compost and then we take that material and we spread it on the ground. We're not going to want to do that if we're talking about anthrax. The other reason is that the composting process, above ground burial processes, those processes are all good processes for inactivating many viruses and many bacteria, but not spore formers. So absolutely, we do need to consider what the animal died of when we're choosing a disposal method. So using a couple of the methods that we talked about now, if we had a human health concern and we choose our method poorly, then we're going to actually amplify that human health concern by potentially spreading that material over a larger area. In terms of other examples that we have seen of human health impacts, we have seen wide area groundwater contamination from carcass burial activities. There have been areas where there was water that was pumped from wells and that was actually red from the decomposition products, the blood, et cetera, from carcass disposal activity. So that is something to keep in mind. Obviously, with animals, warm-blooded animals, there's going to be lots of pathogens, gut bacteria that we'd be concerned about as humans as well, that when they contaminate the groundwater zone. We don't want E. coli, et cetera, in our drinking water supplies. So that's an example of a human health concern related to these animal health response activities.
We're getting lots of questions here, Gary, so if you're happy to carry on for the moment, we'll carry on with those. But in the meantime, I appreciate that some attendees might need to leave us. And one thing that's come up from a number of people is your contact details. Would you be able to just say those slowly?
Sorry, the next slide. So now I've hit the next slide, Mel, and that's right here on the screen. You can see my contact information.
Right, we can leave that up for people. So
Yeah.
if you're okay to carry on, Emma's asked a question about cost of different methods, and appreciates that it depends on the amount of animals you've got to deal with. So I just wondered if you've got any sense of the more cost-effective elements here.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's lots of factors that go into it. So I can just say, excuse me, relative cost, if I may. So in terms of relative cost, traditional deep burial is quite inexpensive. And so that may be the cheapest method. And again, there are environments where that is okay. But as you have more animals, or if you have environmental conditions like a shallow groundwater table, there can be significant impacts from deep burial. And that's why we look for new methods. So relative cost, we have deep burial. Next to that, this shallow above ground burial process is quite inexpensive, but it does require a little bit of carbon material, so that's something that you need to source. Composting can be relatively inexpensive as well. And then from there, you can go to open burning. The cost, again, it all depends on many factors. But relatively speaking, open burning is still relatively inexpensive. And as we go up on this scale, then we get to some of the controlled burning, like the incineration methods, etc. So I didn't talk about all of the methods. I was focused on some of the research that we've done, but landfilling and rendering, those are also good methods, but they get then to the high end of the scale in terms of general cost for these activities.
We've had a couple of people ask about sort of adding additional things, particularly to above ground burial. So for example, would you consider adding chemicals or water to aid composting, or other biologically active materials like manure or gut flora, for example?
Yeah, so those are great questions. We're actually in the middle of doing some research on that right now. So we have, we have done some above ground burial projects where we used a little bit of compost material on top, basically because it had lots of active biology in that material to speed up the process. That worked quite well. In manures, we've used quite frequently in composting. That works well. Typically, for any type of burial, we don't like to add manures to that. So shallow burial, deep burial, we try to minimize manures a little bit. As I mentioned, can add some biology to that process, which is good. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the vertical migration of nutrients. And so any additional nutrients you add to that process, you are increasing the likelihood that you're going to have vertical migration of nutrients like, nitrate, which of course, we're all familiar with blue baby syndrome and other negative impacts of nitrogen contamination in groundwater. So we can use a little bit. In composting, we can use more. We use quite a bit of manures in composting, particularly in a disease situation, because we can inactivate the disease agents in that manure as well, which allows us then to more safely handle that manure after as part of that disease eradication process.
Great. And just
and I also mentioned there are some biological some seed bacteria. We're just about to start a project with above ground burial, looking at comparing side by side with the addition of some seed bacteria versus a pile where we aren't, and seeing how that increases, or if it does have an impact on the carcass degradation process.
Thanks. Okay, so one last question. We've just asked if after above ground burial or the grinding approach with above ground burial, is the final result a usable soil? For example, a non-food use like cut flowers.
Yeah, so and that's a great question because I didn't really talk about what happens after that above ground burial process. So really, we look at above ground burial as being a treatment process. So what happens is when we create an environment where those carcasses can degrade in the environment, what we're doing is we're creating. I should clarify. So if we're talking about whole animals and we use this above ground burial process, it's not nearly as rapid of a process as composting. So typically we anticipate for a full year. So you would put the animals in the above ground burial system and you would plant vegetation on top of it, and you wouldn't disturb the site at all for a year. And in that year's time, the microorganisms in the soil would break down the carcasses. And at the end of the year, then you could regrade that site and return it to its original use as pasture or cropland or whatever it might have been. We're not actually ever removing any material again from that above ground burial site. So we're not trying to recover a nutrient-rich material that you would necessarily want to use for potting soil, et cetera. What we are seeing is we're seeing that site is enriched, and we're seeing differences in vegetative growth above that site versus adjacent to it because we have more organic material, we have nutrients. So we're seeing some direct benefit right directly above that. But at this point, we haven't been attempting to remove that material for a beneficial use.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you, Gary. Thanks so much for all these questions, and also thank you attendees for providing such interesting questions. You clearly are talking about something that a lot of people have got interest in, so I thank you for your contribution to the conference. So our next session is going to be in an hour and 15 minutes, and that is Dr. Rebecca Hasted talking about large animal rescue. So please join us again in an hour and 15 minutes time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.